Tom, let's start with you. In a recent note, you said you were watching China very carefully, saying it's the biggest single threat to shares of Apple. So how seriously are you taking this threat from President Trump?
Yep, I think today you have to assume that everything out of China will be tariffed. And I think that on that assumption, then you have to think about who has pricing power. And if you look at Apple and you take, for example, the least expensive new iPhone, the XR, is 7.5% more expensive than last year's least expensive new iPhone, the 8. So I do think Apple has pricing power and versus their peers can better withstand tariffs, assuming the next round is everything coming out of China.
Well, I mean, Tom, let's put the potential impact aside. I mean, do you think this is real? Does the president mean it?
Absolutely. So if you think about to date, you've had multiple rounds of tariffs. You have one tariff in place today that escalates from a 10% tariff to a 25% tariff on January 1st. So I think at this point in time, you have to make the assumption that tariffs are real and that there's more to come. And as far as what more could be tariffed, I think you have to assume that everything coming out of China may be subject to a tariff.
So Mark Gurman, Tim Cook is spending some quality time with Ivanka Trump today. Will that make an impact? And how has the administration's relationship been with Apple? Does Tim have the currency with the administration to make an impact here?
That's a great question, Brad, and I think they do. If you saw what happened in early September, Apple put out a statement saying that two of their most valuable products, the AirPods and the Apple Watch, would be impacted by the tariffs. This was on the first $200 billion worth of goods. A couple days later, not too long after that, the Trump administration came out and said, okay, we're not going to allow tariffs on the Apple Watch or the AirPods anymore. Now Trump has this day to spend with the president's daughter and obviously a close advisor. Surely to discuss this is going to be one of the topics on the agenda besides the schools they're visiting. And so I think they have that sway power with the Trump administration as they've shown in the past. And they'll probably discuss how this would be bad for Apple, which, you know, at the end of the day, despite exporting a lot of goods from China, is a US-based company.
So, Tom, let's say that Tim is not successful today making his case to the president's daughter, and we do see a 10% tariff on iPads and iPhones that have not been previously affected by this trade war. So you talked a little bit about how Apple could potentially mitigate the impact with the XR. What about the XS, those premium-priced phones that, you know, some suppliers and analyst reports say maybe it's not doing as well as Apple had hoped?
Sure. So generally speaking, I think investors are underestimating the ability of companies like Apple to mitigate the risk of tariffs. And for example, what you're seeing is the Chinese government is actively devaluing its currency. So that'll take some of the sting out of tariffs. We're also hearing that in some instances, the Chinese government is subsidizing manufacturers who might be affected by it. Additionally, a lot of Apple suppliers are already moving their supply chain out of China. And really, on a short-term basis, the big winner from the prolonged China-U.S. trade war is Vietnam, as you're seeing a lot of manufacturers starting to make products in Vietnam rather than China. So I do think that Apple and other companies that are heavily reliant on China for their supply chain have a lot of opportunities to mitigate risk from tariffs. As it pertains specifically to the XS, I think the good news for Apple the last two product cycles has been with the higher average selling prices, they don't have to sell as many units to bear the fruits from a financial standpoint.
Mark Gurman, do you agree with that? I mean, this has not been a great season from what we know so far for Apple. Shares are down. You have suppliers like Foxconn saying they're ramping back production. Surely a 10% tariff, perhaps Apple can mitigate it somewhat. Can't be good news for Apple in the holiday season of 2018.
Yeah, absolutely not. I don't think this is good news for pretty much anyone, the consumer, Apple, or the suppliers. The suppliers, they're already losing money on Apple because Apple squeezes them so much. Apple plays multiple suppliers against each other in order to get the best prices. So from that standpoint, given Apple's power, they will be able to mitigate the 10% tariffs if those do indeed come into effect somewhat. But I don't think it matters. I think aside from that, the iPhone is clearly not selling as well as expected. We saw 4 Apple suppliers that make significant components for the company lower their revenue estimates for the current quarter, all during the same week, all citing a major consumer electronics company. So that is pretty alarming. So it's just bad news after bad news, stories for Apple here, and I don't see it getting much better in the short term.
Tom, is the market misinterpreting the news from these suppliers like Foxconn?
Well, all right, so 2 things. One, going into when Apple reported the September quarter, they indicated they're experiencing weakness in emerging markets, but importantly not China, in Brazil, Russia, India, and Turkey. So I think they were trying to adjust expectations to begin with when they reported the September quarter. But I think the other thing we're overlooking is one of the reasons for the tariffs is to not only improve our trade imbalance with China, but also to protect the intellectual property of U.S. manufacturers such as Apple. So while Tim Cook's done an amazing job of balancing a tightrope between managing the China suppliers, selling a large portion of their products to Chinese consumers, and then also managing sales and things like that, Apple actually stands to benefit from some of the things I think the tariffs are aimed to protect, which is the intellectual property rights of U.S. companies, including Apple.
So, Mark, what kind of argument do you think Apple CEO Tim Cook is making today with the president's daughter?
I think it comes down to this is going to hurt the consumer more than anything. That has been their argument from the Apple Watch standpoint and the AirPods standpoint, and that worked, clearly. That was their argument, and then the Trump administration reversed course. So why not try the same trick again? If Apple has to increase the price of iPhones, people are going to buy less of them, and they might want to look to phones manufactured by the Chinese in the first place, like Xiaomi and Huawei. I think that's a fairly good argument. If our phones are too expensive, where do you think the consumers are going to go? Which would defeat the entire purpose of, or one of the purposes of the tariffs in the first place.